as we're nearing the semesters, and eschatology is a really appropriate subject, right? So, yeah, as you prepare your final assignments and exams, people say, I don't need homework. I've been broke since the beginning of the semester. Or setbacks are when you sit back and do nothing. Or, yeah. The professors tell me to buckle down and study, but my driving instructor says buckle up. Okay, such contradictory directions, I think I'll just watch a movie. And I hope the banks, the interest rates are higher than those among my students. Anyway, so we had too many of these. Let's just get on to that. Didn't realize I had this many of these. Okay, so we're going to study the book of Revelation. And sorry so many people are not here, because it's probably a sign of partial rapture. Anyway, Revelation, is it a scary book? Well, it depends on how you're living. I mean, is it meant to be a scary book? Well, it depends on how you're living. But it shouldn't be scary to believers. But it's easily misinterpreted. You have a lot of people thinking a lot of strange things, and sometimes taking strange things away from class too, if they were kind of in and out. So the student who gets a 666 marked on their forehead, just to show that they've taken Revelation. Anyway, but people speculate too much, and then other people borrow their speculation. Like the one who said, if he decided when the rapture will be, and the person said, I think it's still up in the air. Sometimes Revelation is popular for the wrong reasons. And end-time debates aside, it can be a very practical book, not just for telling you what place in heaven all the missing socks had congregated or whatever, but what kind of themes will we find in the book of Revelation? I mean, I love to preach from Revelation because of all the practical themes that we find there. One of them is the importance of prayer. We see that the prayers of the saints move history, just like in the book of Daniel, where you have kings rising and falling. But the highly favored one is Daniel, who hears from God and is praying to God, and ultimately the nations are moved according to God's purposes. Worship. We have a picture of heavenly tabernacle in the book of Revelation. What kind of furniture do you see in heaven in the book of Revelation? By furniture, I don't mean desks. Well, if there had been desks, I would mean that. But yeah, go ahead.
Throne, pillars, Ark of the Covenant.
Yeah, throne, pillars, Ark of the Covenant. Ark of the Covenant is 1119. The throne, of course, is all over the place. In the Old Testament, where was God enthroned? In heaven, and that is the correct answer. I need to be more specific. Where in the temple was God enthroned?
The inner temple.
Yeah, in the Holy of Holies, enthroned above the cherubim, so above the ark. Also, we see, notice the sea of glass in heaven. Just a lot of the things that you have. Now, the sea of glass didn't appear in the tabernacle in the Old Testament, but it appeared in Solomon's temple. So 1 Kings 7 or 8, thereabouts. Well, it was a sea of bronze there. But you have also people playing harps, just like the Levite priests in the temple. So you have a whole lot of features of heaven that are portrayed like a temple. And what do you do in a temple? You worship. And so it shows us a lot about worship, and it shows us that the closest we can get to heaven on this earth is when we're worshiping the Lord. We also see the Spirit's empowerment for evangelism, like in 1910. The testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. We also see a major theme in terms of compromise versus holiness. This comes out already with the 7 churches in Asia Minor. Some of the churches are compromising with the values of the world around them, sexually and in terms of idolatry, whereas other churches are being killed by the same world system with which their brothers and sisters are compromising. So we see a vast contrast in Revelation's own audience. But not only in Revelation's audience, but we also see it in the contrast between, we've heard of the tale of 2 cities. You've got a tale of 2 cities in the book of Revelation, the contrast between Babylon, prostitute, and New Jerusalem, the bride. And the difference is Babylon, representing the values of this world, depicted as a prostitute, those who are willing to settle for temporary gratification rather than being the bride of the Lamb, those who are willing to persevere and wait for something far more glorious than what this world has to offer. And then hope, because after Revelation 6 through 18 comes Revelation 19 through 22, or after Revelation 6 through 20 comes Revelation 21 to 22, depending on which view of the millennium you hold. And John also functions kind of as a role model, hearing God's voice, because as we see John responding to these dramatic things, he's shocked. It lets us kind of know how we're supposed to respond too. After chapter 1, which is provides the narrative introduction to the book, also the epistolary introduction, which is framed by the God who was, who is, and who is to come, the Lord Almighty, which is pretty cool when you think about it. We don't have to worry about what's to come. We don't have to worry about what we're going through, because the God of history, the God of the beginning and the ending, is the God who has all of it in his hands. And some of that same language, the beginning and the ending, the first and the last, Revelation 1:8, is applied to Jesus in the book of Revelation. Like in the first and the last, I think it's around verse 17. He holds the keys of death and Hades. It's not the emperor who has control over whether you live or die. It's not a plague that has control over whether you live or die. It's the one who holds the keys of death and Hades. And in Egyptian mythology, that was Anubis, the god of the underworld. In Greek mythology, in Roman mythology, it was Hades or Pluto, the god of the underworld. But in Wisdom of Solomon, the Jewish document, it declares that only God delegates a lot of things, but only God holds the keys to death and the underworld. But Revelation declares that Jesus is the one who was dead and now is alive, and he holds the keys of death and life. And then in chapters 2 and 3, we have Jesus' pastoral letters to these different congregations. In the form of them, you have oracles to different cities, for example, in Micah chapter 1, oracles to different nations in Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Isaiah and Amos. You also have sometimes imperial edicts to different cities. Well, here we have prophetic letters kind of in the form of edicts, but especially in the form of prophecies. Thus says. But instead of saying thus says Yahweh, as in the Old Testament, it always says thus says, and then gives a description of Jesus, who is Yahweh. So we have letters to 7 churches. They all follow roughly the same format. Thus says, gives a description of Jesus, often from his Revelation in chapter 1, verses 13 to 17. And then also we have what they're doing right, if anything, what they're doing wrong, if anything, and then promise, and then this is what the Spirit says to the churches. So in other words, we can all listen in, we can all learn, because even though the instructions are given specifically to specific churches, there's something in them that we can all learn from. So to Ephesus. Ephesus's problem, I mean, they were great on discernment. They were like these discernment ministries that can go hunt down false prophets and false apostles anywhere. Although sometimes discernment ministries go too far and hunt the wrong people. But in the case of the church in Ephesus, they were great in finding who was wrong, but they lost their first love. They lost something that mattered even more. And Jesus was ready to withdraw their lampstand from its place. Smyrna, be faithful to death, and I'll give you a crown of life. Now, the church in Smyrna, here we have a series of contrasts, because the one who's speaking to them is the one who was dead and now is alive. And he promises that if they're faithful to death, they'll receive a crown of life. And he has various other contrasts. He says, you're poor, but you're really rich, and so on. Their persecution is going to lead to martyrdom. There's one other persecuted church. By the way, these are the only two churches where there's no reproof. It's all good. Because I guess when you're persecuted, you have to be sold out to Jesus to hang in there. Or maybe when you're totally sold out to Jesus, you're more likely to get persecuted. Probably some each. But the other persecuted church down here, that's Philadelphia, they're to endure suffering, but they'll be delivered from theirs. It won't be permanent, and it won't end in their martyrdom. So you have Ephesus, Smyrna, and then two churches where they're struggling with very similar things. They're tempted with compromise, because you have false prophets there. One of them is called Balaam, and the other is called Jezebel. How many of you think that's the name that their parents gave them? Probably not. But they are like Balaam and Jezebel in the Old Testament, who lead God's people into sin and therefore bring about God's judgment. And false prophets who are saying the Spirit is speaking to them, but they're condoning eating food offered to idols, and they're condoning sexual immorality. And God doesn't put up with sexual immorality, and he doesn't put up with idolatry. So they're called to avoid compromising with the values of the world. Contextualization is good, but contextualizing the gospel just makes all the clearer what its message is. It can make it more appealing to the culture. It can also make it more offensive to the culture, depending on where the culture is vis-a-vis the gospel. But the gospel has its demands. There's only one God, and he calls us to be faithful to him and to be faithful in our marriages, or future marriages, faithful in advance. Laodicea. I skipped Sardis. Sardis and Laodicea are kind of in the ballpark. If you've heard of a dead church, Sardis is the prototypical dead church. He says, this church is dead. So you've got the church that has to be faithful to death, and they'll get a crown of life. But then you have a church that has a reputation for being alive, and it's really dead. Even though he says, some of those there will walk with me in robes of white. So not everybody, even in the dead church, is dead. But then we come to Laodicea, and that contrasts with the church in Philadelphia. The church in Philadelphia had little strength, but God's strength was with them. But the church in Laodicea, they thought that they were rich, they were really poor. They thought that they could see, but they were really blind. They thought that Laodicea was a wealthy banking community, and so sometimes the values of the culture spill over into the church. Now, I know that wouldn't happen to any of us today, right? Actually, today, often we can judge errors in the church and other cultures more quickly than we can judge the errors in our own. It's sometimes easier to pull the splinter out of somebody else's eye than to get the log out of our own. That's why we need the global church. We need other voices to help us sometimes see our own weaknesses that we're so accustomed to, we don't notice them. But the church in Laodicea was definitely settled in with the world. Prosperous community, and because of that, perhaps the church, which was also prosperous, didn't recognize its need. They had become self-sufficient. And so he tells them they need to depend on him. But he says, as it is right now, you guys make me want to puke. That's pretty strong language, right? He says, whom I love, I discipline. Therefore, repent. Turn around, and I'll come in and fellowship with you. Jesus wants to do lunch with them, but they're really holding aloof because they think they can do things on their own instead of depending on the Lord. And the expression that he uses, you make me want to puke, or you make me want to spit you out of my mouth, he uses an image that would be very familiar to them. When we think sometimes of being hot and cold, we sometimes think hot means fired up for Jesus and cold means spiritually dead. But that's probably not what's going on in this passage. Rather, what's going on in the passage is Jesus is saying to them, at banquets, people would like to drink cold water, and at banquets also we often drink hot water, just like we might drink hot tea or hot coffee or whatever, hot chocolate. So both cold and hot water were valued, but lukewarm water was considered disgusting. And Jesus says to the church in Laodicea, you're lukewarm. You're not useful to me. You're not pleasant to me like both hot and cold water could be. Instead, you're disgusting to me. Laodicea had a lot of advantages. They were wealthy. They had their own medical establishment there in Phrygia where they produced eye salve, or at least there's strong possibility of that. So they thought they had everything going on. But there was one thing that people in Laodicea complained about. Their water was piped in via stone barrel pipes, and there are a lot of lime deposits in those pipes. In fact, even the water that comes in the waterfall facing Laodicea, you can see the lime deposits there on the cliff. The only nice thing that the geographer Strabo had to say about the water in Laodicea was that the water in nearby Hierapolis tasted even worse. In other words, hey, we've got money, we've got this, we've got that. They have their own textile industry, black wool. So Jesus says you're naked, and they say, no, we're clothed. But the one thing they admitted wasn't good in their town was the water. And so Jesus says, you guys are just like that water you complain about. You make me sick. But if you'll change, if you'll recognize your need to depend on me, we can be intimate together. But first, we're going to look at some principles for interpretation. We're going to do these just briefly because you'll probably get these in the Old Testament, or you already got them in the Old Testament, because there's a lot of prophetic literature in the Old Testament. But most prophetic books in the Old Testament are largely poetry. Now that's the books, that's not the individual prophecies to kings or something like that. And actually, it becomes a lot more prosaic after the exile. But before the exile, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Hosea, Amos, so on. A lot of those books are mostly in poetic form. And we need to allow them, therefore, some poetic license. In ancient poetry, well, Hebrew poetry in any case, but yeah, ancient poetry in general, it was usually rich in symbolism. So you should try to catch the basic point. You don't read too much into details. It's the same like with the parallelism in Psalm 1:1. You don't preach a 3-point sermon about these 3 positions, sitting in the seat of the righteous, walking in the way of the righteous, and so on. It's parallelism. It's 3 ways kind of saying the same thing, reinforcing the point. And a lot of the imagery is figurative imagery. Job says, my steps were bathed in butter. He doesn't literally mean he bathed his feet in butter. He means, he was just so prosperous that there was a lot of butter available. And with prophecies, some details remained obscure even until their fulfillment. You didn't know how they were going to be fulfilled until after it happened. Sometimes we need to take into account that the prophecy was already fulfilled. So, for example, when in Matthew 24, Jesus talks about the abomination of desolation in the holy place, Matthew 24:15 and Mark 13:14. Well, he also said some things would be fulfilled within a generation, and that one was fulfilled within a generation in the year 70. Well, depending on 66 or 70, but both were within a generation. Jeremiah's prophecy of Jerusalem's destruction, that happened the first time around, 586 BC. Some prophecies may be partly fulfilled, yet remain partly future. So Isaiah and other prophets, they prophesied the restoration of Israel, that God's people would come. Well, actually, it's already in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 4, Deuteronomy 30. God's people would be scattered if they disobeyed, but then they would be gathered back to the land. In Jeremiah, this wasn't something that had happened before Persia sent people back, Cyrus sent people back. So it was really amazing that people could talk about that in advance. Some scholars don't think some of those things were in advance, but God is God. But God announced that he was going to restore his people. And he announced the deserts blossoming with flowers and the Dead Sea coming to life and so on. Well, when the Judahites returned to the land and they rebuilt the temple, and there were a few people who were so old they remembered the previous temple, Solomon's temple, they were like, this isn't as big, this isn't as glorious as the earlier temple. And people were disappointed. Like, where were these glorious prophecies of restoration? Yeah, we're coming back to the land, many of us, but it's not complete. It's not all that was said. And then during Jesus' ministry, remember when blind eyes see and deaf ears hear? That's Isaiah 35. The good news is preached to the poor. That's Isaiah 61. So another phase is unfolding. But then there are things that we're still looking for in the future. The full consummation of the kingdom, when our God reigns unchallenged. Everybody acknowledges that he alone is the Lord. So prophecy in the Bible wasn't always fulfilled all at once. Sometimes it's fulfilled in phases because they weren't interested so much in the timing of it as the completion of it. Jeremiah prophesied 70 years, and Daniel finds out when the 70 years are almost fulfilled. Okay, yeah, part of it's fulfilled within 70 years, but you got 490 years before all of it's fulfilled, and so on. So some of God's unconditional promises remain future. But you don't want to read, in terms of any kind of human methodology we can read apart from some sort of direct revelation, we don't want to read into prophetic texts extra fulfillments that we don't have reason to. After the fact, you can say, oh, you can look back and say, okay, maybe that was it. But prophecy teachers go wild with some stuff. Some stuff in Ezekiel that was already fulfilled, for example, prophecy teachers will use that to try to tell you what's going to happen in 1982. Oh, it's past 1982. Anyway, that's how they used it in 1981. Yes?
Something I see a lot in like lay apologetics is like this like list of all these prophecies that like this is why like Jesus has to be like who he is. Or so by this logic then is that really not what we're supposed to be doing with that?
Some of the prophecies that Jesus fulfilled are clearly messianic in their context. Isaiah 11, Isaiah 9. Some of the others are really analogies, like analogies with Israel's history and so on. And so the connection would only be seen in retrospect. There are a lot of things that were only understood in retrospect. Certainly 2 stages to the coming. I mean, he's coming, he came already and he's coming again. That wasn't something, the phases weren't evident beforehand. So, people can go too far with that. But at least with that, we can look back with some of the stuff where people were saying, this is going to happen next year, or within the next 10 years, this has to happen. I don't even know when we're talking about prophecy teachers, do you know what I mean? People who say, this is going to happen. They're kind of like astrologers in a sense, except they do it from the Bible, kind of reading divination, sort of, from the Bible, but not in context. That's the point I'm trying to make. It's one thing if you're reading in context, but we have prophecy teachers who want to claim that every detail is fulfilled in our generation, which tends to make 2 assumptions. First of all, every detail must pertain to the last generation. That's wrong. I mean, you can look at things that were already fulfilled, and Jesus says, this is being fulfilled in your hearing, and so on. And then the other assumption is that we're the last generation. How do we know that? Most generations in history believe that they were the last generation, or getting close. Paul says in 2 Thessalonians 2, the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. 1 John 2:18, even now there are many antichrists. You've heard that an antichrist is coming, but even now there are many of them. Since no one knows the day nor the hour, not even the Son, not even the angels in heaven or the Son, but only the Father, the devil certainly doesn't know the day nor the hour. So he's always going to have an antichrist in waiting. There are a whole series of antichrists through history. If I had been in Germany in World War II, and particularly if I had been Jewish or Polish or part of the Roma people or something like that, or African, I would have thought Hitler was probably the worst it could get. But history's still going on. Many of the biblical texts are general enough to be reapplied in each generation to keep us on our toes, to keep us focused on the big picture, which does get fulfilled. For example, John prophesied the downfall of the new Babylon. And the Babylon of his day was the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire has fallen a long time ago, and the church is still here. Or the good news going out to every nation and people and tribe, that we would all be one before God's throne. I mean, in the first century, that seemed like an absurd thing to prophesy. But over the past century, the gospel has shifted regionally to such a dramatic extent. I think in my wife's country, for example, about a little over 100 years ago, 1% of the people claimed to be Christian. Today, it's about, I think, 90%. Now, not all those are really Christians by any means, but it's a dramatic shift in, I forget the exact statistics, but Africa, Asia, and Latin America comprised a fairly small minority of Christians in the year 1900 compared to what we call the West. But today, over 60% of all Christians in the world live in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. It's headed towards 70% and increasing. So now we're going to reveal the identity of the Antichrist. Barney is a cute purple dinosaur. Sorry, this picture isn't purple. I don't know how to color it in. But anyway, Revelation was written in the time of the Roman Empire, so perhaps the code, the secret code, is in Roman numerals. So you take the Roman numerals in cute purple dinosaur, you convert them into their numerical value. C for 100, V for 5, L for 50, and so on. You add them up, it comes out to 666. Is this a coincidence? No, this is proof that Barney the dinosaur is the Antichrist. This is an example of the cool stuff you can get if you prepare your Revelation sermons based on stuff on the internet. What is the key to interpreting the book of Revelation? Hal Lindsey, have any of you heard of Hal Lindsey? He was very popular in the 1970s. Hal Lindsey thought it was the Scofield Reference Bible and notes that Luther and Calvin didn't have this end-time revelation. But Luther believed he was an end-time interpreter. Could Lindsey be wrong? And of course, I think he was, but anyway, prophecy teachers often interpret Revelation according to current headlines, which is why they have to revise their interpretations as headlines change. Some historians have documented this process all through history. So Dwight Wilson starts in the late 1800s and shows how prophecy teachers consistently have been misinterpreting texts, saying, this is going to happen next, this is going to happen next. Once in a while they get it right, and those are the ones that they tell, but you look at their full record, they're usually wrong. And Richard Kyle and others have actually traced it through all of history, these kind of mistakes. I need to fix this slide. It wasn't Genesis 49, it was Deuteronomy. But anyway, the same kind of hermeneutic was used. There were some evangelicals in the 1970s. They wanted to make some good money off of Middle Eastern oil. And they said, we know there's going to be oil in Israel because it says in Deuteronomy 33 that at the heel of Asher, there's oil. So they looked in a map, they figured out where the heel of Asher would be, they drilled for oil. They invested like $1 million. Things were cheaper back then. They didn't find oil. If they had just looked it up in a Hebrew dictionary, they would have saved themselves a lot of trouble. The Hebrew word does not refer to petroleum. It refers to olive oil. But in any case, people who interpret the book of Revelation according to modern newspapers, did other generations have access to modern newspapers? Could they really be the interpretive key? Reading Revelation in its original setting fits one of the basic rules of Bible interpretation that we use everywhere else in the Bible, which is cultural background. Revelation specifically names its audience, literal churches in Asia Minor, names the churches. These were 7 of the 8 most prominent cities in Western Asia Minor, in the Roman province of Asia Minor. We don't allegorize the church in Philippi or the church in Corinth when we read Paul's letters. Why would we do that with the 7 churches in Revelation? I mean, the prophetic text in Revelation may use a lot of symbolism, but the letters, maybe we should read them as letters. And some people have said, no, this fits church history. These are 7 stages in church history. It doesn't really fit that very well, and you had to keep revising which churches went with which as church history kept on going, since that people tried to do that. But anyway, Revelation claims that its first hearers could understand it. Revelation 1:3. Blessed is the one who reads, and blessed are those who hear. Why is it one reader and plural hearers?
One person has been reading it aloud.
Yeah, one person has been reading it aloud. Most people were illiterate, and even if they were literate, they didn't have their own copies. So one person would be reading it, and others would be hearing it. He says, blessed are those who hear and heed the words of this book. So how can you heed something if you don't understand its basic point? And we may not understand all of the details of the imagery, but there's enough there that can summon us to live our lives in light of it. Also, Revelation 22:10 says, don't seal these things up, the time is at hand. It's a deliberate contrast, direct contrast to Daniel chapter 12, which says, seal these things up, the time is not yet. Revelation says, don't seal these things, the time is at hand. So it was meant to be intelligible already in its own generation. Further, if today's newspapers are the key, then no generation could understand the book till now. If instead it was meant to be understood the way it was written in light of its own context, well, that's the same principle we take for granted when we realize it was written in Greek, and we either need to read it in Greek or have a good translations. So all scripture is inspired, profitable for teaching, reproof, correction, instruction, and righteousness. That includes the book of Revelation. Here's an example of newspaper hermeneutics. The kings of the East, Revelation chapter 16 and verse 12. Well, in the late 1800s and up until the end of World War I, Western interpreters often interpreted the kings of the East as the Turkish Ottoman Empire. Why were they kings of the East? Well, Turkey was to the east of the West. But would they have been to the east of the 7 churches of Asia Minor? No, they were in what's now Turkey. So the Turkish Ottoman Empire couldn't be what it was talking about. Well, after the end of World War I, the Turkish Ottoman Empire was dismembered, and they had to find a new interpretive key for that. And they said, the kings of the East, that refers to Imperial Japan. And in World War II, see, it's Imperial Japan. At the end of World War II, the West and Japan become friends. And so they change it. They say, it applies to Communist China. Look how well this fits. Great Red Dragon. Kings of the East must refer to China. After détente with Richard Nixon going to China, the West says, actually, China is our friend. And so they had to find somebody new to whom to apply it. Is this a good method for Bible interpretation? The one thing these interpretations have in common is anti-Asian ethnocentrism. But in the first century, when it speaks of the kings of the East crossing the river Euphrates, everybody in the Roman Empire who knew anything about world goings on, so most of the urban people in the Roman Empire, knew that the river Euphrates was the boundary between the Roman and Parthian empires. You just start randomly reading through Roman literature, you'll find that. The Parthians had recently invaded what's now Turkey. They crossed the river Euphrates just a few years before Revelation was written. And they had somebody who claimed to be a new Nero at their head. Well, that didn't end up with them getting as far as where the 7 churches of Asia Minor were. They were repelled. But this was a very present threat in the minds of people in the Roman Empire, particularly in Asia Minor. Parthians were known for the long hair. They were known for being mounted. It fits some of the imagery in Revelation chapter 9. They were the inhabitants of the old Persian Empire in Iraq and Iran. It was using a terrifying image of invasion, the most terrifying image of its day. Does that mean that that would be translated today as they have to be from the same region, or maybe it's just meant to represent something really terrifying? I don't know the answer to that, but hey, if it gets fulfilled, then we know, right? Anyway, some things your hermeneutic has to wait to fulfill it, but I think it's probably just referring to terrifying invasion. Newspaper hermeneutics produces embarrassing results. So if any of you remember David Koresh, affectionately or unaffectionately known as the Wacko from Waco, Jehovah's Witnesses predicted special end-time events for 1874, 1878, 1881, 1910, and so on. They kept predicting the end of the world. It kept not happening. They kept rescheduling. But it wasn't just Jehovah's Witnesses. The difference between Jehovah's Witnesses and a lot of other Christians, that is documented in the annals of Baptists, Pentecostals, Christian Missionary Alliance, and so on. I mean, it's you go back and read the old periodicals. A lot of other people were saying, hey, it's just around the corner. The end of World War I, Kaiser Wilhelm, he's the Antichrist. That was the American and British side, not the German side. But all these predictions about when the world would end, the difference between the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Christians was that the Christians would just reschedule and not keep harping on, well, we actually were right. It didn't mean that. It meant something else. Whereas the Jehovah's Witnesses, they kept it on the books. But it's been going on through history. Hippolytus said the world would end around the year 500, which was safely after his death. Nobody could call him a false prophet then. St. Martin of Tours declared that the Antichrist had already been born. Martin died in 397. Perhaps the Antichrist has displayed remarkable longevity. Others predicted the Antichrist for the year 1000, the year 1184, and so on. And we could give examples from the medieval period, but skipping to the Reformation period, since most of you are Protestant, I'll just hit on the Protestants here. Luther expected the end within a century. Now, he didn't actually say it would come within a century, so we need to. Some of these are more egregious than others. Some of them are like reasonable guesses. Right? We're supposed to be looking for the coming of the Lord, so it's not wrong for us to think, okay, hopefully he's coming back soon, but once we start setting dates, we mess up. Early Puritans thought that the millennium ended in 1300. I think from a post-millennial perspective, they were expecting the end soon. Anabaptist Melchior Hoffman expects Strasbourg to become the New Jerusalem. He died in prison there 10 years later. Thomas Müntzer, he was kind of a 1500s liberation theologian. He expected the peasant revolt of 1524 to produce the final judgment. Instead, thousands of peasants died, and he was executed. Back then, end-time speculations died hard, sometimes literally. 1600s and 1700s. One of the major early Baptist leaders, Thomas Helwys, believed that persecution by King James I, yes, that's the one who authorized the King James Version. Let this be known to all Baptists who still use the King James Version, that early Baptists thought that King James was the Antichrist. There are reasons why the King James Version speaks of baptized with water. Definitely an Anglican, not a Baptist translation. Anyway, 1700s, Quakers were predicting the end. Jonathan Edwards thought that the Great Awakening might lead to the end. Many Americans felt that the Revolutionary War was the final one, and King George III was the Antichrist. However, for you Methodists here, Wesley thought that King George was pious, and actually Wesley was more correct. But anyway, 1800s, John Nelson Darby came up with, or at least some people argue it was a little bit earlier than this, but John Nelson Darby circulated the idea of the pre-tribulational rapture. Didn't really catch on widely until the Scofield Reference Bible picked it up, but then it got propagated all over the place. Mormon and Millerite, now I'm not throwing all these together on everything, like Millerites and Darbyites were Christians, just they had interesting eschatological things. But Mormons and others, they held a lot of interesting end-time views from the Spirit, usually historicist type, where they were trying to read history into the details of the book of Revelation, past history. When the Civil War was impending, many northern ministers expected it to usher in God's kingdom on the side of the north. Many southern ministers expected it to usher in God's kingdom on the side of the south. Effective urban evangelist William Booth believed that his Salvation Army was God's main means to establish his kingdom on earth. Booth was post-millennial. He believed they were going to establish God's kingdom on earth. And in his day, the Salvation Army was one of the main means. But I'm just trying to illustrate how views of the end times have shifted through history. 20th century, actually, I think it wasn't a Nazi forgery. It was an anti-Semitic Russian forgery that the Nazis adopted. But some prophecy teachers in the 1920s found their views confirmed in the protocols of the Elders of Zion, which turned out to be a forgery. 1948, Israel became a nation, and some prophecy teachers said, we've been saying that all along. And some of them had been, but some of them hadn't been. And the ones who had been, many of them said it couldn't happen before Israel turned to faith in Christ. So 1970s, a computer in Belgium known as the Beast. Do any of you remember that? Most of you weren't around in the 1970s, but I was converted in the mid-1970s, and I was scared of computers because somebody said, there's a computer in Belgium known as the Beast. This is the Antichrist. And fortunately, I asked him after the service, does that mean that all computers are bad? He said, oh, no, just the one in Belgium. Well, you know the one in Belgium known as the Beast? That computer never actually existed. That goes back to a novel that somebody quoted, and then somebody else quoted their quote. And, anyway, I don't know if anybody remembers Salem Kirban, but Salem Kirban in the 1970s said that Henry Kissinger, Richard Nixon's Secretary of State, would be the Antichrist. I remember hearing somebody around 1981 who said that within the next year, based on the passage in Ezekiel, the Soviet Union was going to invade Iran and shut off the world's oil supply. Well, this isn't just a matter of delay. The Soviet Union no longer exists. Well, maybe they meant Russia, I don't know, but I don't think that's maybe. But the big one was one, and it's kind of hinted at by Hal Lindsey and some others in his late Great Planet Earth, which was the nonfiction bestseller of the 1970s, although I don't really consider it personally to be nonfiction. But said that Jesus would return within 40 years of 1948. But he didn't say definitely would happen, but implied that that was probably the case. And Jesus would come back by 1988. How many of you were born yet in 1988? Yay! I'm not the only one. Okay. So I was actually doing my doctorate. I started my doctorate by 1988. And this was a matter of some mockery in the 20,000 circulation Duke University newspaper, because U.S. Christians bought over 3 million copies of an engineer's book, 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Could Be in 1988. Now, if I were traveling across a bridge, I would want it done by a competent engineer. I would not want it done by a New Testament scholar. who was not an engineer. However, for books like, understanding the Bible, some people gravitate more towards books by respectable people like engineers rather than. Anyway, this is just the frustration of a professor. Sorry, but 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Could Be in 1988. He published an updated edition in 1989, and for some reason, very few people bought the updated edition. 89 Reasons Why Jesus Might Come in 1989. Let it never be said that North American Christians are so gullible that we can be deceived 2 years in a row by the same person. Early and modern predictors of times and seasons have shared only one common flaw. They've always been wrong. So, some questions to consider when interpreting the book of Revelation. That was what I just indulged in, was what scholars sometimes call reception history, looking at how texts have been interpreted, although I was giving you some of the really bad examples. But some questions: in what language was Revelation originally written? Aramaic, Greek, Hebrew, Portuguese, or Pig Latin? So I give you a multiple choice. English, exactly. That is the view of many current prophecy teachers, exactly. Anyway, but it was written in Greek, although the person may have been thinking in a Semitic language. To whom does Revelation claim to be written? 21st century Americans? Some people seem to think that, but prophecy study Bible editors, Zondervan Revelation commentators, yes. Hal Lindsey, Tim LaHaye did the Left Behind series. They wrote on End Times for Zondervan, and so did I. But we do not hold exactly the same views. To whom does Revelation claim to be written? It specifically says 7 churches in Asia Minor. The local color fits the cities addressed. I gave you an example from Laodicea, which is actually one of the stronger examples. And if you look at them on a map, these 7 cities where these churches are, actually, they appear in the same sequence in which a traveler would deliver the book of Revelation to them. Starting with Ephesus, which is just 30 to 45 miles there's like 30 to 45 miles between the churches, and Ephesus is the closest city, closest harbor to Patmos, where John was exiled. And I already talked about this, where the original reader is supposed to be able to understand Revelation. Blessed is the one who reads and those who hear, and don't seal these things up, for the time is at hand. So, which of the following methods, therefore, is most helpful for understanding the book of Revelation? Modern newspapers, study Bible prophecy charts, demented Revelation professors, or the history and culture of the first century? Now, there are various approaches to the book of Revelation among academic approaches. The idealist approach looks for timeless principles in the book of Revelation. And of course, when you're preaching, that's what you're going to focus on. You're going to focus on those principles. But the pure idealist approach doesn't look so much for relevance in particular periods. The historicist approach says that what happens in the book of Revelation corresponds to events in history before the end. And therefore, it tries to make a one-on-one correspondence between these events. It's like Revelation is a history book written in advance. The preterist approach says it's relevant only to the first century. Some will say it was even completely fulfilled then. The hyper-preterists even take the resurrection of the dead as already fulfilled. I don't know how they can get away with that. And 2 Timothy says that view is heretical. But anyway, the futurist position says it's all future. This is the thoroughgoing futurist position. An eclectic position could say that the principles were relevant to the first readers, which would be similar to preterists on that, and looking for principles, it's similar to the idealist approach, but saying that it also can include some past events, like when the child is caught up to God to his throne, that already happened before Revelation was written, and some future events, 19 to 22 or 21 to 22, depending again on your view of the millennium. So I mentioned this last week, but we've got a couple different views among those who talk about a rapture. One is that it happens just at the second coming, at the end of the age. Another is it happens 7 years before that and marks out a 7-year tribulation, or in some views, a 3.5-year tribulation, in which case they're called mid-trib, but it's just pre-trib with a shorter tribulation. I was actually taught the pre-trib view, and it actually was a turning point in my early Christian life, because when I realized I can't make this fit, it doesn't fit the context of the verses that are cited in support, it doesn't fit. For me, that was a turning point, because I decided from now on, I'm not going to just believe in people. Tell me the Bible says. I'm going to, I was already reading the Bible for myself, but I said I'm just going to believe what the Bible tells me that it says. And you probably don't want to throw out all your pre-existing doctrine and start from scratch all at once. It's kind of overwhelming. But you can work through doctrine by doctrine and work through text by text. But sometimes we have to adjust our views to fit the evidence, like this professor who experienced partial rapturism. This is a joke, just in case you only listen to the audio after this class. So, some views about the millennium. The earliest church fathers in the 2nd century, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, and actually Papias before that, they seem to have been premillennial, post-tribulational. That is, they believed that there was a future 1,000 years coming, and they believed that they were either going to go through the tribulation or they were already in the tribulation. Now, Justin Martyr did note already, though, in his own time, in the mid-2nd century, that there were different views. So that wasn't the only view, but it's the view that's best preserved at that time. By the time you get to Augustine, in the medieval church, Luther and Calvin, the dominant view by far was amillennial. They believed that they were in the millennium. And especially once Constantine became emperor and the persecution stopped, people said, well, we're no longer in the tribulation. Now we must be in the millennium. We're reigning with Christ, with Constantine as his vice regent. And so amillennial view became dominant. And in some sense, the amillennial approach that some held was kind of post-millennial. They believed that they were in the millennium, it would last 1,000 years, Jesus will come back. So there were a lot of people 1,000 years after Constantine believing that the day of judgment was just around the corner. But the more exegetically defensible amillennial position is that it stretches from Jesus' resurrection and our spiritual resurrection with him to the second coming. And so that Revelation goes in cycles, which I'm going to argue it does. But the question is the millennium another one of those cycles, or is it future? And amillennialists would say that it's identical with the other cycle. It's tribulation from one perspective, it's reigning with Christ from another perspective. Because we died with Christ, but we've been raised with Christ. So, and victory comes through martyrdom. So, the amillennial, actually, it makes sense. Well, both premillennial and amillennial, I think, are very defensible positions on Revelation. Post-millennial, I don't think so much. But anyway, Jonathan Edwards, Charles Finney, most born-again Christians in the time of the Great Awakenings in the U.S. were post-millennial. They believed that we would establish God's kingdom on earth and then Jesus would come back. So there's great optimism that fueled an approach toward missions where they believed they were going to win the world for Christ. But sometimes it blended into colonialism, manifest destiny, and so on in secular forms and became abused. But it was very common. I think even probably Wesley was post-millennial, but Wesley seems to have held two different views. He seems to have held two millenniums, so he was kind of easy to get along with, whether he was, Pre-tribulational, premillennial started circulating in 1830, became popular in the early to mid-20th century. The dominant views among current evangelical New Testament scholars are post-tribulational or amillennial, although some Reformed and some Charismatics, there's been a resurgence in post-millennial, which I find a bit worrying because post-millennialism was part of the 19th century optimism in its liberal form and in its conservative form. And it was shattered in the reefs of World War I. So its positive aspect is trust that God can do anything. Its negative aspect is thinking that we can finish the job before Jesus comes back. And I think that's misplaced. I don't think it fits Revelation at all, where you have the church being martyred and the gospel spreading. But anyway, and how many of you here are millennials? So you have to be careful how you pronounce that, because if you tell somebody I'm a millennial, they might think you're a millennial. Which you might be, but just in case. So, how much of Revelation is literal? Well, some people emphasized, like some of the reformers emphasized literal interpretation of Scripture because they were reacting against allegorizing Scripture. But they didn't mean that there wasn't symbolic language in Scripture. They just meant don't turn it into a bunch of allegories. We take narratives and epistles literally, but there was already a recognition that much of the poetry and the prophecy was meant to be understood symbolically. Nobody takes everything in Revelation literally. It's just virtually impossible to do that. Revelation 1:20 says, here's what these symbols mean. That probably implies that there are some symbols there, right? The lampstands represent the seven churches. The stars represent the angels of the seven churches. Revelation 1:1, God sent and signified the book. Now, signified could just mean communicated, but often it means to communicate by means of signs. And elsewhere in the book of Revelation, where it uses a related term for that, it refers to these signs in heaven that are symbolic. But if somebody wants to take them literally, I suppose they could. Like in Revelation 12, you have this woman clothed with the sun. Is that literal? Is this literally a woman literally clothed with the sun? I mean, we are about 93 million miles from the sun on average, depending on the time of year. If we were just twice as close to the sun as we are, we'd all be burnt on crisp. What if we were in the middle of the sun? How long would we last? Is this woman literally clothed with the sun? I don't know anybody who thinks that, but I'm just saying, if you want to take everything literally. So, Babylon, mother of prostitutes, Revelation chapter 17. So you meet a prostitute, you want to witness to the prostitute, and you say, oh, I read about your mom in the Bible, the mother of prostitutes. Is that what it means? Probably not. Well, nobody takes that literally. So some people would say, okay, well, take literally as much as possible. Who made up that rule? I mean, wouldn't it be more reasonable to say, let's read it consistently And if a lot of the descriptions in Revelation are symbolic, maybe we should take a lot of the other descriptions of Revelation as symbolic too. After all, you often have that in Old Testament prophecy, and you have it a whole lot in apocalyptic literature, like First Enoch and so on. It had already been circulating, and people were familiar with those kinds of symbols. So First Enoch 86, is it, or thereabouts, 85, 86, you have stars falling to the earth, impregnating cows, and that's supposed to represent the sons of God bringing the daughters of men in Genesis 6. Yes?
Oh, we're going to say that Misha and Abednego, they survived a burning furnace, so maybe we can survive something.
Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, yes, they survived them. Actually, there probably is an allusion to them. They refused to bow down to the image of the king. Daniel 3, in the same way, in Revelation 13, we're not supposed to bow down to the image of the beast.
That was supposed to be a joke.
I know, but I was trying to turn it into something that would help to show that it actually can advance the lesson. So, you know, I like to use jokes. So.
I just don't want to confuse anybody.
Yeah. Don't. He was joking. So, Revelation regularly reapplies traditional biblical symbols. For example, you have plagues. You also have the locusts. The trumpets and the bowls evoke the judgments on Egypt. So Revelation's trumpets and bowls. Water turned to blood or wormwood. Well, you have water turned to blood in the plagues in Exodus. Darkness, you have in both. Fiery hail, you have in both. Sores in Revelation 16 and boils in Exodus. And you have locusts in both. And you have deliverance by the blood of the Passover lamb. Here's just a picture where, there's fiery hail. But anyway, does this mean that Revelation is just narrating the past judgment on Egypt? In Revelation 8 and 9 and in Revelation 16? Or is it using this imagery from the Old Testament to say these future plagues are like the plagues on Egypt? And in the same way, Revelation has some weird monster locusts. And it recalls the language of the book of Joel, where you have these, this army of invading locusts. Now, in Joel, in the English text, in Joel chapters 1 and 2, you have this invading locust army. But you get to Joel chapter 3, and you have an army of all the nations gathered together against Jerusalem. So this locust army kind of prefigures an eschatological army. The day of the Lord, it's both called the day of the Lord, but a nearer judgment prefigures a future judgment or a later phase of judgment. Well, Revelation uses the image of locusts and then does it up some more for some time, ways that are relevant for some time. Revelation 5, 5, and 6 reapply the Jewish expectation of the warrior Messiah. Jewish people expected a conquering warlike Messiah who would be like a lion. Well, John hears about a lion who's overcome or conquered. When he turns, what does he see? Does he see a lion? What does he see? A lamb. And what kind of lamb? A slain lamb. I mean, lamb itself is an epitome of weakness in contrast to a lion. Slain lamb, that's the epitome of weakness. Revelation is the same message theologically as the rest of the New Testament. God overcame sin by the cross. His power is perfected in weakness. Well, who are the 144,000? Jehovah's Witnesses. No. Jehovah's Witnesses originally claimed that they were the 144,000. They later revised that because there were more than 144,000 of them to say just a lot of the original ones were the 144,000. But if you're going to take the number literally, you need to take the rest of it literally. they need to be male Jewish virgins. I asked my classes, how many of you are male Jewish virgins? And one time I had a student who was a male Jewish virgin, but how many of you are male Jewish virgins? Well, then you're not the elect. I'm wasting my time. No, just trying to wake you up. Okay, so, but when they started, they were partly right, I think, because this is the number of the saved. How many of you are saved? See, some of you are not raising your hand because you know you're not male Jewish virgins. Chapter 7 and verse 3 is seal on the foreheads of the servants of our God. 144,000 servants of God. Everywhere else in the book of Revelation, the servants of God refers to all believers. And some Jewish people, at least, we get this from the Qumran War Scroll, expected a great end-time army that would go out and slaughter the Gentiles for God. And some, such as Richard Bauckham, have suggested that the 144,000 represent an end-time army. And holy warriors were to abstain from intercourse before battle. So how many of you are looking forward to going out and slaughtering the Gentiles for God? One of you raised your hand. But Revelation may reapply this traditional Jewish end-time image as a symbol, because elsewhere in Revelation, believers are spiritually Jewish. Or as Paul puts it in Romans chapter 11, Gentiles who believe in Jesus are grafted into the heritage of the Jewish people. So, in the first century, Gentiles who became followers of Jesus understood that they were converting to a Jewish faith. The churches in Revelation 1:20 are depicted as lampstands. Well, if you look through ancient Jewish inscriptions throughout the Roman Empire, the symbol for Judaism at this time, for synagogues at this time, was a lampstand, a menorah. It wasn't a Star of David that came to be circulated centuries later. It was a menorah, a lampstand. And also in Revelation 2:9 and 3:9, believers in Jesus are viewed as true Jews because they're following the God of Israel. Like Joseph's and Pharaoh's dreams, you can have two visions or two dreams that represent essentially the same thing. And so many scholars believe that's what's going on in Revelation chapter 7. There's two ways that I think both have a legitimate possibility of being correct. One is that 144,000 represents the Jewish remnant, and then the chapter 7, verses 9 to 17 represents the innumerable multitude from every kindred, tribe, and people and nation. But I think the other view is actually more likely because of some of the details I want to mention. And that is that in Revelation 7, 9 through 17, this innumerable multitude from every kindred and tribe and people and nation is the literal meaning of the 144,000. So the 144,000 appear in Revelation on Mount Zion, Revelation 14:1, standing with the Lamb. They are the New Jerusalemites. How many of you plan to be in the New Jerusalem? Those who didn't raise their hands are not male Jewish virgins, right? Anyway, the reason that they're virgins, I think, is because the same reason the New Jerusalem is portrayed as a chaste bride prepared for her husband. You've got both the masculine and the feminine image of the New Jerusalemites. In both cases, they're chaste. They're sexually pure. And so, spiritually virgin, not compromised with the prostitute Babylon. And so, you have 144,000 from every tribe, 12,000 from each of the tribes. But then in 7, 9 through 17, we read about an innumerable multitude from every tribe and people and nation. And then they're described in a couple different ways. They're described in language that's taken from Isaiah chapter 25 and language that's taken from Isaiah 49:10. And in those passages in the Old Testament, it refers to what God does for Israel, his people. But Revelation specifically applies those passages about Israel to this innumerable multitude from every kindred, tribe, people, and nation, indicating that they've been grafted into the heritage of Israel. It also implies something else, that what God does, what Yahweh does for his people in Isaiah, God and the Lamb do in Revelation, indicating that Yahweh is not only the Father, but also the Lamb. So remember when John hears about a conquering lion, what does he see when he turns around? Yeah, slain lamb. Here, he hears a number, 144,000. What does he see? He sees an innumerable multitude from all peoples. So, grafted in. Now, why the number 144,000? Well, 12 squared times 10 cubed. The number of God's people was normally 12. But more explicitly, John reuses these symbolic numbers. Now, your translation may or may not say this, depending on what your translation is. But in Revelation chapter 21, it gives the dimensions of the New Jerusalem. It's 12. It's like 1,400, 1,500 miles long and wide and high. Now, if it were literally 1,500 miles high, what level of the atmosphere would that be in? Yeah. I mean, the troposphere only goes up 11 miles. 1,500 miles high, that's pretty high. How high is Mount Everest? It's about 5 miles high. So here we're talking about something like well over 1,000 miles higher than Mount Everest. And the air is already getting thin on Mount Everest. This is a really tall skyscraper, right? But the numbers in Greek are 12,000 stadia times 12,000 stadia times 12,000 stadia. So we have the 12,000 reused. And the wall, the dimensions are 144 cubits. Now here we can use our engineers. 144 cubits is like around 200 feet. Does a wall of 200 feet fit a city that is something like 1,500 miles cubed? The dimensions don't fit, but what it does, it reminds us, it calls us back to the 144,000. This is the city of God for the people of God. The New Jerusalem for the New Jerusalemites. All of us who are God's people, who've been grafted in, or if you're already Jewish by heritage, you're back in your own tree, the way Paul would put it. We are the New Jerusalemites. We will be with him forever and ever. Now, why is it shaped like a cube? What in the Old Testament was shaped like a cube? Anybody know? On the next slide. Okay. It's not the ark. It's not the tabernacle or the temple. It's the Holy of Holies. So the New Jerusalem itself is shaped like a cube. That's why John can say in Revelation 21, I saw the temple there, because God and the Lamb are the temple. That's why Revelation 21 says, and he will dwell with his people forever and ever. And he will be our God, and we will be his children. So we'll be in his presence, undistracted, forever and ever. Just like in the Old Testament, you could enter the Holy of Holies if you were the high priest. once a year. But we will experience the fullness of God's glory with our glorified bodies. We'll be able to withstand it and worship Him. Revelation also reapplies some other symbols current in its day. It reapplies a lot of Old Testament imagery, but it also reapplies other imagery. For example, for 666, various interpretations have been proposed for the meaning of 666. Luther said it was the Pope. Pope said it was Luther. Democrats said it was Ronald Wilson Reagan, who had 6 letters in his first, middle, and last names. Republicans still think it's Bill Clinton. Oh, they might think it's Obama. I don't know. They're probably going to switch it to, anyway, never mind. These things get switched around a lot. So, but if you make up the rules as you go, say you divide by 4, add 6, multiply by 3, whatever. If you make up new rules, you can make anything come out to 666. In fact, when I was an undergraduate, we had some students who just for fun made their teacher's name come out to 666. But in the first century, there were special rules for how to get numbers from names because each Greek and Hebrew letter had a specific numeric value. So in Hebrew, Aleph, Beit, Gimel represent 1, 2, 3. In Greek, Alpha, Beta, Gamma, 1, 2, 3. That's why in Greek, 1 Peter, for example, is Petru Alpha. They didn't have 1; they used Alpha as 1. Am I giving you too much detail, or is this? Are you with me? You graduate students, good. Okay, so some had actually played with the name of Nero in Greek. It doesn't come out to 666 in Greek, by the way. But Nero's name in Greek does come out to the same number when you turn the letters into numerals and add them up. It does come out to the same as the sentence, he killed his mother, which incidentally he had. So people, that was part of the bathroom graffiti back then. Nero Caesar is his name, killed his mother, it is the same. But what happens if you spell Nero Caesar in Hebrew letters? It comes out to 666. Unless you spell it slightly differently, in which case it comes out to 616. And there are a few manuscripts of Revelation that instead of having 666, they have 616, as if they knew the answer to the riddle, but recalculated the Hebrew. Is this just a coincidence? Oh, it's possible. But Revelation also speaks of a head wounded to death and then revived. That's a parody on Christ's resurrection. In Revelation 17 also speaks of the evil ruler as being one who was, is not, and is to come. It's a parody on the God who was and is to come. But it's also interesting and may serve double duty because by the time Revelation is written, probably in the 90s of the first century, there were a number of imposters who arose claiming to be Nero because it was so widely believed that Nero was going to come back. Dio Chrysostom, at the end of the first century, says, most people believe that Nero is still alive. Just like a lot of people, after Hitler died, thought he's still around somewhere. A lot of people think Elvis is still around somewhere, but that's different. He's not. Elvis is not known for violence, but anyway. Nero died in the year 68, but both Romans and Jews expected his return. Now, some people looked forward to his return. A lot of Greeks liked him. Some Jews liked him. But Roman aristocracy didn't like him. But some imposters actually got the Parthians to follow, fake Nero got the Parthians to follow him and invade Asia Minor just a few years before Revelation was written. So people were looking for a new Nero. And Revelation 17, when it speaks of 7 kings, one was, but is not, but is to come. I already mentioned the parody aspect of that. But also it's saying this is a king who was one of the seven who was just mentioned, but he is not alive now, but he's coming back. So a king who was dead is coming back, who was one of the previous emperors. Who might that be? Well, we know who a lot of the early Christians thought it was. In the Armenian language, Nero is still the word for Antichrist. In Armenia was one of the first Christian kingdoms. Armenia and Ethiopia were the first Christian kingdoms. So if you skip the three usurpers, Nero actually is one of the seven, although in Revelation everything's seven, unless it's 12. Once in a while, 4. Does this mean we should be looking for a literal new Nero coming back from the dead? Probably somewhere in Italy where he died. Anyway, probably not a literal one, any more than literal Moses or literal Elijah in Revelation chapter 11. Rather, it's more like saying he's coming in the spirit and power of Nero, like John the Baptist came in the spirit and power of Elijah. In other words, you thought Nero was bad. Wait till you see what's coming. This is going to be another person like Nero. So, Revelation is warning us to grow strong in faith. It's saying, you've seen hard times. Harder times yet are coming. It'd be like somebody today saying you thought Hitler was bad. Wait till you see what's coming. Or Stalin, or Pol Pot, or Idi Amin, or the apartheid regime, or whoever. If you love Jesus, you better be prepared to die for him. Now that doesn't mean you go out and try to die for him. Just like the 7 churches of Asia Minor, some were facing persecution. Some were facing other kinds of tests. Do we compromise with the values of the same world system that's killing our brothers and sisters elsewhere? Are we as radical for Jesus as those who have to die for their faith? We can be tested by persecution, or we can be tested by non-persecution. We can be tested by hard times. We can be tested by temptations to materialism, consumerism, or other things. Each of the churches had a different test. Each of them had something different that they had to overcome. We don't get to choose our tests, whether as churches in particular parts of the world or as individuals. But one thing was said to all the churches. The promise was given to those who overcome. So whatever our test is, we need to overcome. And we could probably do that better, though, if we listen to the voice of the local church and where Christians are suffering for their faith. There's a lot that we can undoubtedly learn from them. My brother, my now late brother-in-law in Congo was a professor of chemistry at the University of Brazzaville. He didn't have the same kind of academic opportunities I have. He didn't have, the research libraries available. He didn't have, English being a major research language in the world right now. I couldn't have done the things that I've been able to do if the Lord hadn't come through for me. I mean, the day before I was going to call Duke and tell him I couldn't come because I only had $1 and the Lord provided the money. And when I was going to have to go work in a fast food restaurant after finishing my PhD because I didn't have a teaching position, within 24 hours of when I decided, barring a miracle, I'm running in the street this year, the Lord provided to the dollar what I decided I needed to live on that year as an advance in a book that the Lord wanted me to write. And so I spent the year writing that book. He knows what he's doing. But I also know that the Lord gave me these advantages. I didn't have any money when I started. I could not go to school. If the Lord has given us these advantages, and we know that there are other people who didn't have these opportunities, who would have worked really hard if they had had the opportunities, may we take full advantage of the opportunities we've been given on their behalf and work extra hard to serve them. And what they have to give us, even their testimony, is important for us. Now, some of you here have been through persecution. I mean, I've been beaten on the street and had my life threatened for sharing Christ. Some of you have been through persecution. Some of you have been through not knowing where your next dollar was going to come from. So some of you actually have stories that others of us here can learn from. But that's why we're one body. We all need to, like the 7 churches in Asia Minor, we can learn. Let those with ears hear what the Spirit says to the churches. How many of you have heard of the mark of the beast? How many of you are wearing something over your face to cover up the mark of the beast? No. Okay. So no, those things are good to wear to prevent the spread of viruses. But anyway, the mark of the beast in the book of Revelation is in contrast to the name of the Lamb. So in the end of Revelation 13, it says, here are those who have the mark of the beast and the number of his name. There are no chapter divisions in the original. So what chapter comes after chapter 13? Has nobody here taken the math prerequisite? 14, yes, thank you. We would never, the class would have gone on for hours. Anyway, yes. And the very next verse, it talks about those who have the name of the Lamb written on them, as opposed to the mark of the beast. The point is, you've got to serve somebody. Revelation chapter 22 and verse 3, those who have the name of the Lamb written on them, it says they'll serve him. And verse 4, his name will be on their foreheads. Well, the name of God and of the New Jerusalem will be written on believers. And in chapter 3, verse 12, it says that we'll be pillars in the house of our God. And the name of God and New Jerusalem will be written on us. Now, how many of you think we'll be literal pillars holding up the ceiling? Like this one here. Oh, hello? Anyway, brother, it's figurative imagery. I mean, we still use the expression today like pillar of the community. It's an image of strength and actually would fit also the image of the new eschatological temple. God's temple made up of Jew and Gentile, and so on. So the name of God and of the New Jerusalem will be written on us. People often had inscriptions on pillars, no surprise. But if we're not literal pillars, is the name literally written on us? Also, the name of the prostitute and on Jesus. Revelation chapter 17, verse 5, she has a name written on her, the name Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes. And Jesus has a name written on him, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Does he literally have a name written on him? Or is the name written on him in the vision so that John will know that's the name? And is Babylon literally the mother of prostitutes with a literal name written on her? Or is Babylon a symbolic entity? And therefore the name written is symbolic. So what I would argue is that you've got a lot of entities with names written on them in the book of Revelation, but they're not meant to be literal. It's a way of identifying their identity or their ownership. You've got to serve somebody. Will it be the beast or will it be the lamb? And in the world's eyes, a beast can tear a lamb easily. And so the world would rather identify with the beast. If we identify with the lamb, we identify with the cross. We have to be willing to suffer with him. But we know that we'll also be raised with him. So, what does Revelation mean by Babylon? We will talk about that after the break. So, what does Revelation mean by Babylon? If we look at the description of if we look at the description of Babylon in Revelation chapter 17, it's the city on 7 hills. Well, again, if you just randomly read through ancient Roman literature, you'll quickly find that Rome was referred to as the city on 7 hills, the city that was founded on 7 hills. Some other cities trying to imitate Rome mentioned 7 hills that were part of their area too, but really it's just widely spread in ancient literature that was Rome. In fact, every year Rome held a festival celebrating the founding of their city in 7 hills. It was called the Septimontium, or the 7 mountains, 7 hills. So the city on 7 mountains, Babylon, that points to Rome. The city that ruled over the kings of the earth. Well, to China, it would have been news that Rome ruled over the kings of the earth. To Parthia, it would have been news that Rome ruled over the kings of the earth. But to the 7 churches in Asia Minor, when they thought of the kingdom or the empire that ruled over the kings of the earth, in their part of the world, they would think of Rome. And also, if you look at the merchandise that's listed in Revelation chapter 18, verses 12 and 13, the imports fit pretty closely the list that we have for the imports of Rome in Pliny the Elder's Natural History, written just a couple decades earlier. So it's the mercantile power that traded in exactly the kind of merchandise that's listed in Revelation. But more to the point, Rome oppressed the Jewish people like Babylon did, and destroyed the temple like Babylon did. So Jewish literature of Revelation's day already called Rome Babylon. It was compared to Babylon in 4th Ezra and 2nd Baruch, which might be later than Revelation. There's sometime around the period of Revelation. But apparently the Sibylline oracles. But most importantly, Daniel had a vision of 4 world empires, starting with Babylon. And by the 1st century, the 4th empire was regarded by Jewish people as Rome. So they saw Rome as a new Babylon. Now, was Rome the only Babylon of history? If there could be a new Babylon, there could be a new Rome. Through history, all evil empires have fallen and now lie in the dust. Antichrist's rise and fall, but the ultimate future doesn't belong to them. So if some things I said earlier made you anxious when you hear the news or watch the news, this should be our encouragement. Because all through history, yes, there have been evil empires, there have been Babylons, but they don't prevail. And the Church of Jesus Christ, which over and over again seems to look like it's going to get squashed by evil empires, is stronger now than it's ever been. In John's day, the mightiest empire that at least his part of the world had ever known seemed poised to crush the tiny Church of God. But John hears a funeral dirge over this empire. Fallen is Babylon the Great, taking words from Isaiah 21, and the context also taking words from Jeremiah 51. John hears this funeral dirge over this powerful empire. Rome has now been fallen for some 15 or 16 centuries, but the Church of Jesus Christ is alive and well. John was a prophet indeed. And if we can look back and see that and see his prophecy of people from every tribe and people and nation, we can look back. Just as John stood on the shoulders of the prophets who preceded him, we stand on his shoulders and we can take courage that God's plan is being fulfilled. And no matter what forces might be arrayed against the church, the gates of Hades, the gates of death will not prevail. The church will remain triumphant. Revelation includes a tale of two cities: Babylon the prostitute, decked with gold and pearls; New Jerusalem the bride, adorned for her husband. Not just decked with gold and pearls, but the streets in the city are built of gold. The gates are made of pearls. Babylon got its wealth mostly from exploiting the poor. The New Jerusalem, it's all the gift of God. Now, I know talking about characterizing things in terms of a prostitute and a bride might look sexist, and some have argued actually that it's sexist language, but actually he's using the language of his day to communicate. On coins, cities were regularly portrayed as women. In the Old Testament, Israel and Jerusalem were portrayed as women. So this was a way that would easily communicate the image. And Israel, when they were disobedient, they were portrayed as a prostitute. And so in some other texts were Tyre and Babylon. Isaiah 23 is that. Anyway, and also Jerusalem, when they were living right, and sometimes when they weren't, God portrayed them as his bride or his wife. So it's recycling this language. It's not intended in a sexist way. It's intended just to illustrate the contrast. We also have a male image of chastity with 100 foot over 1,000. Yes?
Dr. Keener, would these churches in Asia Minor have been sufficiently versed in this Jewish Old Testament literature? I mean, because there are a bunch of Gentiles in these churches.
Well, yeah, there were a bunch of Gentiles in the churches, but again, for the churches to be portrayed as lampstands, they saw their identity spiritually as those who were heirs of the Old Testament. And so
But did they know the Old Testament to get these allusions? I mean,
those who've been members for a long time would know the Old Testament because they hear it read every week. Those who were new converts, probably not. They wouldn't catch all the allusions, but there would be people there who could explain them. In fact, well, this is harder to prove, but we have some evidence supporting it. It makes good sense. When Judea fell, or even before it fell, when war was declared against Rome in the year 66 to 73, during that war, you had a lot of immigration from Judea, and a lot of people settled in the Jewish communities in Asia Minor, and that included many of the Christians. So Papias, in the early 2nd century, tells us that among those who immigrated were people like John the Apostle, Jesus' mother, Mary, also Philip and his 4 daughters. I think one of them got married, the others stayed single. But many people left the Holy Land and settled probably in Asia Minor. So you actually had some Christian leaders who had been around from close to the beginning, even, who could assist in the teaching. But it's a good question, and it's good thinking to consider those things. How Babylon got its wealth. Well, here we have a list in chapter 18, verses 12 to 13, of the different imports that came into Babylon. And it fits pretty well the imports that came into Rome. But you look at where these imports came from. The gold and the silver especially came from mines worked by slaves. And you may remember from our previous discussion of slavery that slavery in the mines was a virtual death sentence. People didn't live that long working in the mines. And these mines had been seized from Spaniards. So it was exploitation. Precious stones and pearls. These were expensive imports from India. And in India, you would have divers who would, they'd actually have to go underwater to get the pearls from the oysters. And that could be a dangerous occupation. But they sold for massive sums. There was one pearl that sold for the price of an entire estate in Rome. And part of that was because the cost kept increasing with all the customs duties paid all the way from India to get to the Roman Empire. Silk, although there was some silk produced in the island of Kos, for the most part, silk was an import from China. Some Romans thought it grew on trees. I guess sort of, but I mean, it's a silkworm, but it was imported from China especially. And you can imagine that would be quite expensive by the time it got there. Citron wood, ivory, costly wood, and marble were taken from North Africa. Cinnamon and spice, incense, myrrh, and frankincense were imports from East Africa. Wheat was not a luxury good, but it was taken in taxes from Egypt and North Africa. So the Egyptian peasants often went hungry, or as I think I said earlier in the semester, sometimes they fled from tax farmers. They would abandon their village and go start a village somewhere else when they heard that the tax collectors were coming if the crops had been really bad that year. But Egypt was considered the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. Rome wanted stability in Rome, and so they had a dole of grain. Every month they would give out grain so that the residents of Rome could feed themselves. When they fell behind in that, Claudius, the emperor in an earlier period, before the year 54, actually got mobbed in the streets because of riots for there not being enough food imported to Rome. But this was at the expense of the rest of the empire, and especially the Egyptian peasants, where the childhood mortality rate, insofar as we can reconstruct it from census records and business documents and skeletons and so on in Egypt, may have been as high as 50%. Half of all children died before reaching adulthood, at least a third. That was common in much of the empire, especially due to malaria and so on. But as high as 50%, while the people of Rome got to be free at the expense of the empire. That's colonialism, imperialism. Human bodies and souls climax of the list. And that language is taken from the book of Ezekiel and refers to the same kind of thing that it meant in Ezekiel. And it was Rome's gravest sin, the slave trade. God cares about economic injustice, both what was plundered directly from the poor and also when we practice conspicuous consumption instead of caring for other people's needs. And Revelation chapter 18 is one of the passages that elaborates that most extensively. Of course, we saw it earlier in James, and Luke talks about it. And if you've had Old Testament and you ever got to the prophets, I know when I told Old Testament in years past, the Old Testament is 3 times as long as the New Testament. I don't understand how they expect anybody to get through it in one semester. But anyway, if you got to the Old Testament prophets, it was already there in the Torah. Anyway, it's all through the Bible. The Bible cares about economic injustice. Now, moving to the time structure of Revelation. We've been doing some things that are less complicated. This one might be a little bit more complicated. Are you guys ready? Do you have a good enough break? You're awake? Okay. Some of you are like, yes, let's go. And some of you are like, oh no. All right. So even the time structure of Revelation may be different from what we think. So looking at Revelation's tribulation, when does the period end? I need some people who can read very, very loudly. Do I have any volunteers? Or I can just tell you, I just summarize the passage if you want me to. I don't put you all to sleep by me just doing all this. If I don't have volunteers, I'll just summarize. So, okay. Anyway, you have three sets of 7 judgments each. You have the seals, and if you look at the 6th or 7th seal in each of these sequences, tell me what this sounds like. So in chapter 6, verses 12 through 17, you have a massive earthquake. Not just the little kinds of earthquakes they were accustomed to in Asia Minor that destroyed Colossae and leveled Laodicea, but being a wealthy banking community, they rebuilt. This was a massive earthquake. And even the heavens were shaken. The stars fell to the earth. The heavens were rolled up like a scroll. And then that was the 6th seal, and then the 7th seal, you have silence in heaven for the space of half an hour. The trumpets, chapter 10 and verse 7 says, toward the end of the trumpets, the time is finished to fulfill all that the prophets spoke about. Chapter 11, verses 15 through 18. Every mountain and island is removed from its place, and the time has come to give reward to the dead. The wicked are judged, the righteous, saints and prophets receive their reward. And then the conclusion of the bowls of anger in 16 verses 12 through 21. Again, we have the mountains and the islands being moved from their places, and we have Armageddon, where the nations are gathered together for judgment. So, do these sound like the kind of events that happen every other Monday night, as you're driving home from class or walking home from class? No. Or do these sound more like a climax of history? So, some people have argued that the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls happen in sequence, but if that happens, the world comes to an end like 3 times. Well, the world as we know it, not the dissolution of the time-space continuum per se, but there's going to be a new creation. But things fall apart as we know them, and probably that means that these are cycles. Like they all end at the same point. They end at the end of the age. So to figure out how long the period is, well, we know when it ends. When does it start? Revelation has a few different passages that talk about the length of time. It's 1,260 days in Revelation 11:3 and 12:6. It's 42 months in Revelation 11:2. It's times and half a time in Revelation 12:14. And that language is borrowed from the book of Daniel, where we read of times and half a time. We read of 1,290 days, which is just 30 days more than the 1,260. And the final half of the 70th week of years, or the 70th 7 of years. So half of a 7-year period is 3.5 years. So the time is pretty much borrowed from the book of Daniel. The question, however, is, does Revelation mean the same thing that Daniel meant? Have you noticed that Revelation sometimes changes the meaning of the symbols that it takes over in the Old Testament, like the locusts, the plagues? But it's taking the Old Testament precedent and reapplying it to different judgments. So these aren't the plagues that happened back on the first Egypt. These are the plagues that happened in the new Egypt. And by that, I don't mean today's nation of Egypt. But in Revelation chapter 11, verse 8, we read about judgments on the place that's called Sodom and Egypt, and where our Lord was crucified. Where was our Lord crucified? Jerusalem. And where was Sodom? Yeah, I think the south end of the Dead Sea. And of course, Egypt is somewhere else. So those can't be literal. Geographically, Egypt and Sodom and Jerusalem are not in the same location. But they represent the same thing in this passage. Sodom, judgment came. Egypt, not referring to modern Egypt, but Egypt in the time of Moses, the plagues came on Egypt. And so in Revelation, we see plagues, we see fire falling from heaven, we see fire coming out of the mouths of prophets. It makes sense. Then this is the evil world system. It's not a geographical designation, it's a symbolic designation for the world under judgment. And it's also called the Great City, which is also called Babylon, which in the Old Testament fell under God's judgment. So the images get reapplied, redeployed in new ways. What about the 1,260 days? Does Revelation mean the same thing as Daniel? Well, Revelation often reapplies Old Testament symbols. If it reapplies the symbol, what would he be reapplying it to? Daniel meant a period of great tribulation. Revelation could use the number to tell us about the kind of time, that is, great tribulation, rather than the length of time. Now, it could be both, but in principle, it could be simply talking about the kind of time. This is talking about a period of great tribulation before the end comes. And other Jewish interpreters actually did kind of stretch that time. So the Dead Sea Scrolls, it became 40 years and so forth. Revelation might simply speak of a time of suffering and not designate what that suffering is. Now, does anybody remember in Daniel chapter 9 why the issue of the 70 sevens of years comes up? In Daniel chapter 7, he's praying because Jeremiah predicted something would happen in 70 years. Well, Daniel is praying about it because the 70 years are almost up, and it doesn't look like it's about to happen. And so God sends a message to him and says, Daniel, it's good you've been praying about this. Some things actually were fulfilled within 70 years, but these are now 70 sabbatic years, 70 sevens of years before it's completely fulfilled. And so it becomes 490 years. Now, Daniel's 70 sevens of years, 490 years. And his final period of 3.5 years is based on a reapplication of imagery from Jeremiah. So Daniel can't complain if Revelation does that to Daniel. The imagery can be reapplied in other ways if God says so. So in Revelation, when does this period start? Now I'm going to need somebody to read out loud, because I want everybody to, but somebody who can read very loudly. I would share the microphone. Well, I have had both my vaccinations now, but I don't know if anybody wants to share my microphone. So just read really, really loudly. Revelation chapter 12, verses 5 and 6. Good, you're in a good location for it too. No, further back. Yeah. Very, very back. But thank you also for volunteering. But
I volunteered to read because I never prayed.
Oh, wow, okay, all right. So when he reads this, think about what happens that triggers the 1,260 days. What happens before it? Oh, sorry. No, that's fine. Actually, if it's loud enough, we could just listen to it on there. But that's so somebody has it on their phone. So anyway, go ahead.
She gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter, and her child was snatched out of God and he was thrown. The woman fled into the wilderness to a place prepared for her by God, where she may be taken care for 1,260 days.
Thanks. So what's the sequence of events here? What happens first in these verses? She gives birth to a son. And what happens to the son? Yeah, he's called up to heaven to rule the nations with the rod of iron. Who is the son?
Jesus?
Yeah, that's always the right answer in Sunday school, and sometimes it's the right answer in seminary too. Jesus, yeah. So after Jesus is called up to heaven to rule the nations, what comes next?
The woman fled into the wilderness.
She flees into the wilderness for how long?
1,260 days.
1,260 days. So when does it look like the 1,260 days might start?
Right after the resurrection.
Yeah, Jesus is exalted to heaven, 1,260 days starts. So the period of great tribulation is framed by the first coming and the second coming of Jesus. Revelation redefines the great tribulation Christocentrically. This is very different from what you get from a lot of prophecy teachers. Now, I'm not saying that's the only tribulation that there is, but some other passages that talk about tribulation talk about what happened in the year 66 to 70 and so on. So there was a common view of an end-time tribulation right before the end. That's what I said, end-time tribulation. And that tribulation now becomes the whole course of this age. So elsewhere in the New Testament, if you ask, when does the end time begin? Well, Acts chapter 2 and verse 17, in the last days, says God, I'll pour out my spirit on all flesh. He was saying that was fulfilled in his own time. Peter was saying this is being fulfilled right now. It was already the last days of the day of Pentecost. 1 Timothy 4:1, the Spirit clearly says that in later times some will abandon the faith. And Paul goes on to say, that's what's happening now. 2 Timothy 3:1, there will be terrible times in the last days. Paul applies it to his own day. 2 Peter 3:3, you must understand the last days scoffers will come. And then Peter goes on to say, that's what's happening now. And Romans 8:22, Jewish people, they spoke of the birth pangs of the Messiah. Paul says, we know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth up to the present time. The present suffering are birth pangs, bringing forth the world to come. And of course, we have other passages. We already mentioned 1 John 2:18, you heard that an Antichrist is coming. Even now there are many Antichrists. Remember the already not yet of the kingdom. We're in the time in between the times. It is an eschatological time already because the Messiah has already come. The Messiah who is yet to come has already come. Yeah.
So, according to the verses that we just read, and what you just said right now, your view is that the tribulation, a great catastrophic tribulation, already happened in the present.
Well, no, actually what I'm saying is that in this passage in Revelation, what it means by the Great Tribulation is pretty much also what you have in John chapter 16:33, where Jesus says, in this world you will have tribulation, but be of good courage, I have overcome the world. So we have a Christocentric reapplication of Old Testament and other images in the book of Revelation, so that the lion is the lamb, and passages about Yahweh in the Old Testament apply to God the Father and the Lamb. And here, time itself is shaped by the Lamb. Eschatology is shaped by the first and second coming of Jesus. So there was a pre-tribulational rapture when Jesus was caught up to God and to his throne. And the next one is when he goes back to rule the nations with, and when the kingdom of this world becomes the kingdom of our God and his Messiah.
So I guess that leaves us with some tribulation, meaning there is no like expression.
Well, I don't know. I still believe that there's probably an intensification at the end, but how do you know which one is the final one? I mean, again, there are many Antichrist figures, and I would have thought Hitler would have fit. I would have thought Stalin would have fit. We will probably see more of them as time goes on. We won't know which one's the final one, the final one, until Jesus comes back and wipes them out. That the difference between the Great Tribulation and the kinds of tribulation we have in this present age, I see them as not a difference in kind, maybe a difference in intensity or something, but there's, yeah, go ahead.
So when asked about this, Jesus responds that we are to look for the abomination of desolation, which is a particular event that appears to happen inside of the Jewish temple, which then also refers back to Daniel, where there appears to be a particular 7-year period of intensification. So why would you not reference that in addressing this particular concept?
I did address it. No?
Well, you're saying that we can't know until Jesus splits the sky himself. But then,
No, I did talk about that period of tribulation, but I said that what I'm arguing is that in Revelation, he's not applying that number literally. He's applying it figuratively, because the literal fulfillment of it already happened in the years 66 to 70.
so then would you also be saying that there would be a figurative fulfillment of the passage in Matthew where there's the abomination of desolation?
No, I think that already happened. I think the abomination of desolation already happened. Yeah. Yeah, I think we talked about that earlier in the semester. I have it on some future, on some other slides, so I'll just keep going and I'll get to that. But it was just meant to be a review. So Revelation's message cuts two ways. Whether you agree with me or not on the chronology in Revelation, because that's more controversial than some of the other things. Some of the other things I think are just obvious based on reading Revelation consistently together, how the things fit together. But Revelation's message cuts two ways. It's an encouragement to suffering Christians. It's a threat to lukewarm Laodicean Christians. To all of us it says, wake up, get ready, Jesus is coming. Now the setting of Revelation, and I think some of this is review that we did it toward the beginning of the semester, but it won't hurt. Emperor worship was going on. That wouldn't have led to persecution everywhere. They didn't actually go around checking for a mark on your identity card saying, okay, I worship the emperor. But if you were accused as being disloyal to Rome and being against the worship of the emperor, and if you weren't Jewish and therefore didn't have an exemption, Rome could ask you to display your loyalty by offering sacrifice to the image of the emperor. And we actually have that exact situation reported in Pliny's epistle to the Emperor Trajan, 1096, in the early 2nd century. Domitian wanted to be worshipped as a god, and he's probably the emperor when the book of Revelation is written, according to early church tradition. Some people have dated Revelation earlier in the 70s or even the 60s, but most of us dated in the 90s. And conflicts with the synagogue are also important. So emperor worship. The worship of kings was an ancient practice. We treated that earlier in the course. Emperor worship was a particularly big deal in Asia Minor, where the 7 churches were. In Rome, it was more or less treated as a big joke a lot of times. I mean, you weren't supposed to be declared a god until after you died. So the 3 emperors who wanted to be declared gods while they were still alive were the ones who didn't get declared to be gods after they died. Ephesus built the first imperial temple in Asia Minor for Augustus. Smyrna built one for the next emperor, Tiberius. Pergamum had a big one. So a number of these major cities in Asia Minor were involved in the worship of the emperor. And maybe 5 years before Revelation was written, Ephesus got another temple, imperial temple, this one to honor the god Domitian. Although in Rome he wasn't considered a god, he wasn't dead yet. If Eastern provincials wanted to worship Rome and the emperor, Roma being the deified personification of Rome, wanted to worship Roma and the emperor, that would make them more loyal, all the better in Roman political ideology. But in Rome, emperors only got to be gods after they died. They were deified by their successor, who was their adopted son. But Christians said the emperor has no clothes. Don't tell them, please, that I showed a picture of someone nude. I could get in trouble for that. Anyway, posthumous deification. To claim to be a god while one was alive is considered very rude. Gaius Caligula, Nero, and Domitian all claimed to be divine while they were alive, so they ended up cursed instead of deified after their death. And I don't need to, well, I don't know. I don't remember if I did this at the beginning of the course. Gaius Caligula was the son of an assassinated war hero, Germanicus. He got his nickname for being carried around the war camps as a sort of mascot. Caliga was the Roman soldier's half boot, and Caligula means half boots, so or little boots. So that was, you'd think he might be innocuous, but he went crazy when he grew up and ordered that his statue be set up in the temple in Jerusalem. So it looked like the Antichrist had come already, but God's people prayed. Before war could break out, somebody assassinated Caligula. Nero had been corrupted by his older boyfriend, Tigellinus, and he went crazy even before he grew up. He burned Christians alive and claimed to be a god, and so it looked like a final Antichrist had come. And again, we have that in some ancient documents where Nero is actually depicted as the Antichrist. But he gets, well, there's a revolt and he ends up sort of committing suicide with some help. Domitian was emperor in the 90s. Vespasian was the general who was originally making war on Jerusalem. He goes to Rome to become emperor. His son Titus finishes the job in Jerusalem. Vespasian reigns for a number of years. When he dies, his son Titus takes over, dies after a couple of years, and then the other son of Vespasian, Domitian, takes over. He claimed to be God while he was alive. According to Suetonius, people were to hail him as Lord and God. So the Gospel of John, written in the 90s, Thomas says, "My Lord and my God." That would take on a very important meaning in the reign of Domitian. I mean, the particular wording goes back to the Psalms, in the Greek translation of the Psalms, "My Lord and my God." But it would also constitute a challenge to the emperor. He expelled astrologers, persecuted Jews and Christians, according to tradition, and you can expect that Asia Minor would be extra enthusiastic in his worship. Good citizens were supposed to worship the emperor, but Jewish people were exempt from that. Everybody knew they worshipped only one God. Rome and Judea had already been through one major war. Nobody was looking forward to that again, although another one happens around 135 AD. Jewish people in Asia Minor, they didn't want any trouble. Jewish people throughout the Roman Empire still had to pay a special tax because Judeans had revolted 3 decades earlier. Many Jews in Asia were accepted by their communities. Places like Aphrodisias, they had special seats for God-fearers in the public theater. They had in Sardis, they had the prime piece of real estate in the city. Right next to the city gymnasium was for the synagogue, and the local synagogue was as large as a football field, very large. Many Jews in Asia were accepted by their communities, and they didn't want apocalyptic, charismatic, messianic fanatics running around saying that there's a new king, and this king is going to come and overthrow the Roman government and prophesying things like that. So you can imagine troublemakers might be expelled from some of these synagogues. Smyrna and Philadelphia are the 2 places where we read about in Revelation persecution. And in these places, it looks like they're being accused by the Jewish community, or parts of the Jewish community, and they've been expelled from the synagogues. We talked about that as background for the Gospel of John. Well, here you have something that fits that, apparently, with Smyrna and Philadelphia. And a generation later, according to the early church fathers, well, according to the martyrdom of Polycarp, a disciple of John, was accused by local Jews in Smyrna and ended up being executed. And the language that they use is very strong. It's not language that should be used in ecumenical relationships today, obviously, but this wasn't an ecumenical situation. This was an intra-Jewish debate, just like the Dead Sea Scrolls call the rest of Israel the congregation of Satan. Well, there were Jewish groups that called other Jewish groups apostate, and kicking the Jewish believers in Jesus out of the synagogues was treating them as apostate. And Revelation responds by saying, no, these are the true Jews. You guys who kicked us out are the apostates. Apocalyptic literature. If this were a whole course, I'd spend more time and go through some examples of this. But you have a number of documents that use symbolic language similar to what you have in the book of Revelation. There are a number of similarities, but there's some differences. Apocalyptic literature claimed to be visionary, claimed often angels to mediate revelations. It was based on symbolic images of the prophets. Sometimes it could be obscure, like Greco-Roman prophecies. Like Greek oracles, it could be political, which could get people in trouble. They longed for the coming vindication of God's people. There was a contrast between heaven and earth, and typically it included scenes of the heavenly throne room, which of course goes back to Isaiah 6, Ezekiel 1, and so forth. And often it would include a survey of history up to the date of when it was written, which I suggested you have in Revelation 12, for just a few verses. And then predictions for the future. Remembering Jesus' end-time teachings will help us. Some of his teachings were already fulfilled in the first century. So in this case, I'm looking at Matthew. I'm actually toying with the idea when I'm working on Mark, that maybe Mark envisions it a little bit differently, but Mark is probably writing before the temple's destruction. Matthew's probably writing afterwards, in my opinion, although all this stuff is open to debate. But the temple's destruction, Jesus says, your house will be left to you desolate in this generation. Well, everywhere else in Matthew's gospel, this generation means the generation then living. Then he speaks of the desecration of the temple that makes desolate. Sure enough, the temple was destroyed in a generation 40 years after Jesus predicted it. Now, it wasn't the only time that that happened. Obviously, it happened under the Babylonians. Antiochus Epiphanes desecrated the temple around 165 BC. In the 70s BC, Pompey, Roman general, desecrated the temple. And in the year 70, Romans destroyed the temple. And in the year 135, they erected a temple of Venus on the site of the temple. And some may consider certain subsequent events in history also as desecrations. What we mentioned before, Josephus thought that the shedding of the blood of the priests in the temple in the year 66 signaled that was the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel. And 3.5 years after that, the temple actually was destroyed. And when the temple was destroyed, the Romans erected on the temple the standards that bore the insignia of the emperor, and they worshipped the emperor as a god on the site of the temple. And that's stated clearly in Josephus. So, do I think the abomination of desolation happened in the first century? I'm pretty sure about that it did happen in the first century. Could it happen again? It's happened more than once in history, so I wouldn't rule it out. The temple would have to be rebuilt for that to happen. I wouldn't rule it out, but neither would I insist on it. Yes?
So what do you do with the text of Matthew saying when you see it standing in the holy place rather than on top of the rubble?
I mean, it was still the holy place. It was still considered the holy site.
So you wouldn't take the holy place to the holy holies?
No, not necessarily. Now, in Mark 13:14, he was writing, I believe he's writing before 70. So that would debate. But in Mark 13:14, the participle for standing actually is a masculine participle, which doesn't match the abomination of desolation. So it sounds like a particular individual will be there. And that's what Paul also envisioned, 2 Thessalonians 2, about the man of lawlessness setting up his throne in the temple, which is what Caligula tried to do. Well, he tried to have his image set up there in around the year 40. I think that after 70, what we get in Matthew is like, okay, well, this is the way it happened. It didn't happen exactly the way we expected it, like the person literally physically sitting there, but the emperor was worshipped on that site. Luke doesn't speak of an abomination of desolation. He says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies. Now, could Jerusalem be surrounded by armies again? It actually has happened more than once, I think. But he also speaks of Jewish people being carried away captive in all the nations. And I'm pretty sure that Luke is talking about what already happened in the year 70. So while I don't have a perspective after the events to promise what won't happen in the future, I do have a retrospective perspective on events, and I'm pretty sure abomination of desolation happened in the first century. Although, I can't say it's the last one ever. This is outer darkness with wailing and gnashing of teeth. And just, I figured if we had more time, I would, why is this not, I'm trying to get out of this. It's not, maybe if I push quit, but then I won't have my next, I have another batch of slides to go to. So for those of you who are watching on television, this is the person who's filming. You actually can see the filmer. Thank you. Yeah, it's this one down here. Thanks. No, this one. Yeah. Thanks. Thanks. So yes, you all have Matthew to thank for this. If you don't want to be in the movie, you can just cut yourself out. Otherwise, So Revelation chapter 12, just to look at it in a little bit more detail, it's the heart of the book. It appears between the trumpets and the bowls, and it may supply some keys to the interpretation of the rest of the book. So you have signs, language that Greeks sometimes applied to constellations. So they might have thought of Virgo or Draco or the serpent for the woman in heaven, or the dragon. Some scholars have suggested that. I don't think Revelation would endorse astrology, but they were aware. Josephus and Philo were aware of constellations and so on. But the differences in the portrayal suggest that Revelation is communicating something different, and we'll look at that. There have been a number of interpretations through history. Wesley, for example, thought the sun represented the Christian world. The moon, as the crescent, represented the Islamic world. And the war with the saints represented the Pope's assaults against the Waldenses and the Albigenses. Now, I don't know how convinced Wesley was of that. He takes a lot of this from Bengal. But anyway, the mother probably represents. Am I going into too much detail? Are you guys all right with this? Okay, all right. The mother probably represents the forerunner of the faithful bride, the New Jerusalem. She also is the opposite of the prostitute, Babylon. Prophets portrayed righteous Israel as the mother of the restored future remnant of Israel. The sun, the moon, and the 12 stars. You probably remember Joseph's dream, where the sun, the moon, and the 12 stars bowed down to him, represented his father, his mother, and his brothers. The labor pains in the prophets. Israel is the mother of the restored future remnant of Israel. The period of great tribulation was a way of portraying, childbirth was a way of portraying a period of great tribulation, sometimes bringing forth a new community. Ignore my Dead Sea Scrolls reference. More than once, they've changed all the references, not all of them, but a lot of the references, especially in the hymns scrolls. So the reference is not correct anymore because they changed the references. But anyway, they renumbered the material. God promises suffering, pregnant Israel that she'll bear new life at the resurrection. And in the day of God's wrath, he'll slay the serpent. So you see a lot of Old Testament background to the image, although I'm going to give you some other background as well. The child who rules the nations with a rod of iron. Elsewhere in Revelation, that's especially Jesus. And especially later on in the book of Revelation. The serpent in Psalm 74:14, the serpent Leviathan had many heads. And that's actually taken from Canaanite mythology, where Lotan or Leviathan, Lotan and Leviathan are the same, it just vocalized differently. But Psalm 74:14, probably the many heads, were 7 heads, which fits the serpent here, which has 7 heads. Here it's said to be the ancient serpent, the deceiver of Genesis 3. And I'm going to skip some of this because I don't have to go into too much explanation of the backstory. But it recycles some images from the Old Testament. It also recycles some images from other myths. The Old Testament took some Canaanite myths and so on and used them for symbolic language. You also have Revelation doing that some. There was an Egyptian myth in which Isis, with the sun in her head, birthed Horus. And the red dragon Typhon sought to slay her. She escaped to an island. Horus was born, and then he overthrew the dragon. The Greek version of the story, the dragon was Python, and he was warned that he would be killed by Leto's son. Leto had been impregnated by Zeus, and she was pregnant at the time with Apollo and Artemis, according to the Greek myth. Well, Poseidon, Zeus's brother, hid Leto on an island and submerged it. And apparently she could breathe underwater, so it was no problem. After Python left, Leto birthed Apollo. And 4 days later, he was strong enough and he went to slay the dragon. The moral of the story is don't wait till tomorrow to eat what you can eat today. Especially don't wait 4 days. We stay away then anyway. Yeah, this next one is kind of iffy. So, but here the dragon slayer is not Apollo nor the emperor. Apollo and all the pagan deities are on the side of the dragon, because Revelation talks about all these false deities as demons. Jesus is the real dragon slayer. So the sacred child here is not the mighty emperor or some deity who is widely accepted in the Roman Empire, but the crucified leader of a persecuted sect. Imagine the audacity of these people, this small minority group who thought that their God was the only true God and he was going to rule the whole world, and thought that they might even outlive the entire Roman Empire. Guess what? We're still here. We have outlived the Roman Empire. The common myth focused on the child's birth. Revelation focuses instead on his exaltation. The fall of the stars. In Revelation, the stars often symbolize angels. So it alludes to the story of the angel's fall, which was commonly understood by Jewish contemporaries as having happened back in Genesis 6. Whatever the correct interpretation of Genesis 6 is, which is debated, First Enoch definitely thought it was fallen angels. But the image of fallen angels is reapplied Christocentrically here. The greatest revolt of the evil one didn't happen in Eden or in Noah's day. The greatest revolt was opposition to Jesus' incarnate mission. And Jesus' exaltation spelled Satan's defeat. Now, in the Egyptian and Greek story, where does the woman flee to be protected from the dragon? An island. But in Revelation, it's not said to be an island. It's a wilderness. Why? The prophets had promised a new exodus, a new era of salvation that would take place in the wilderness. And actually, the Exodus was a good way of looking at salvation too, because you had the deliverance from Egypt, and it was 40 years before they entered their inheritance in the promised land. So it was a good way of symbolizing, the first coming and then the second coming. It doesn't all happen at once. It can happen in stages. Now, as to when the tribulation period is, we talked about that. This is just going into a little bit more detail. And the theological significance of it. Judaism expected Satan's future defeat, but it's already been accomplished in Christ. Now, when I say that, I don't mean that Satan isn't still alive and well on planet Earth. To take another of Al Lindsay's titles, which actually he was right about that one. But again, the image, we may have quoted it here before, although it's probably not as relevant today as it was when Kuhlman was first using it as a scholar, because right after World War II, everybody knew what this was. But the difference between V-Day and D-Day. So after the Normandy invasion succeeded, everybody knew how the war was going to turn out. The Nazi-controlled Germany was going to fall. But there were still people suffering and dying in battles until that happened. Well, the outcome is already decided. Satan has already been defeated, but the battles are still taking place. People are still dying. Spiritual warfare is going on, but the outcome is settled. Well, actually, I forgot to mention this earlier when I was talking about the different reasons for allowing that Revelation might reapply the number in a different way. Revelation probably reapplies Daniel's time symbolically elsewhere. Remember in Daniel chapter 1, when Daniel and his 3 friends refused to eat the king's food, and God blesses them for it. But it's initially going to be a problem because the person who's their supervisor doesn't want to lose his head if they don't look healthier than the others. So Daniel proposes, okay, well, give us 10 days. So they were tested for 10 days, and then they were exalted. Well, in Revelation chapter 2 and verse 10, the church in Smyrna is warned, you'll be tested for 10 days. Be faithful to death, and I'll give you a crown of life. So the testing for 10 days probably is a reapplication of an image from the book of Daniel. Here's the 70 years prophecy. You guys have these slides too, right? You don't have this group batch of slides? Okay, sorry. I'll need to, Kelly, can you remind me? Yeah. So, because this gives in more detail what I summarized from the batch of slides that you all have. This was just going to be if I had time to get to it, which I did because I didn't tell as many jokes this time. Okay, so yeah. So in 12:7 to 11, we have celestial combat. It fits the end time theme of holy war, but here it's applied to a heavenly conflict. Again, the victory decided at the cross. Jesus is exalted to God's throne. Satan, the accuser of brothers and sisters, is cast down. He no longer has the authority to accuse us before God, because after all, if Christ is for us, if Christ is at God's right hand making intercession for us, who dares bring an accusation against us? So we could talk about spiritual warfare, but we've already done that. We could talk about Satan as an accuser before God. I'll just mention this, that already he functioned that way in the Old Testament, in the book of Zechariah and in the book of Job. And Jewish tradition amplified it by saying that he accused Israel day and night, every day except on the Day of Atonement. You know how they got that? They took the numerical value of Satan's name in Hebrew. They calculated the Hebrew letters. They said, it comes up to 364. So, 364 days of the year, he can accuse Israel, but not on the Day of Atonement. But here, Christ's victory silences the one who was accusing God's people day and night. How do the saints appropriate this triumph? Revelation chapter 12 and verse 11. They overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony, and loved not their lives, even to the point of death. So you need to count the cost. Remember that Christ has won the victory. Christ has defeated the devil who stands behind the persecutors of God's people. And I'm going to skip ahead to chapter 13. The end of 12, the serpent makes war against the saints, and chapter 13 describes how that happens. Remember, well, I can't say remember because we didn't cover it, but Revelation chapter 11, you have 2 prophets who speak for God, who act like Moses and Elijah, calling them, well, fire comes from their mouths, not calling from heaven. And also, water turns to blood. Well, here in chapter 13, we're going to have 2 evil figures. So in Revelation, the good guys, saints, are portrayed as a kingdom and priests, which was Israel language in Exodus 19, but it's applied to believers a few times in the book of Revelation 1:5, I think, and Revelation 5, 9, and 10, something like that. But here we have a king and a priest beast. So Revelation 13, describing the beast, you have in Daniel chapter 7, 4 beasts, 4 evil beasts that represent 4 evil empires gathered against God's people. And after them comes one that, instead of looking like a beast, looks like the Son of Man. And of course, we talked about that earlier when we talked about the Gospels. But Revelation 13 doesn't focus on just one of these beasts. It mingles aspects of all four of these beasts together. So it's not just Babylon, although it's called Babylon. It's not just Alexander the Great's empire. It's not just Persia. It's not just Rome. It's Babylon, but embodying all of these. It's the spirit of evil empire. So even though Rome has fallen, there's still the spirit of evil empire in the world. And skipping some of this, it's a composite of all four beasts. It's evil empire. And notice that it looks kind of like its dad. The dragon has 7 heads. So does the beast. The beast is the offspring of the dragon. Aren't you glad that Jesus is the dragon slayer? And after the parallels with Daniel 7 run out, you start having parallels that look a lot more like Nero. Now, a favorite interpretation of who this evil beast is among early Protestants was the Pope. So the early Swiss Protestant exegete Theodorus Bibliander said that the wound was Nero's death, but the Roman imperial line continued via the Pope located in Rome. Today, hopefully most of us wouldn't take that interpretation, but at least he still kept the connection with Nero, which was the earliest Christian interpretation. Nero was the first official Roman persecutor of Christians. They may have been persecuted locally before that. Well, actually, this is a local one too, but it's from the emperor, so it's pretty significant in terms of setting a precedent. Burned hundreds of Christians alive to light his imperial gardens at night, as well as butchering others in other ways. Keep in mind, this is like 34 years or so after the resurrection of Jesus. Or if you date Jesus' resurrection at 33 instead of 30, then it's like 31 years after. The church has multiplied so rapidly that there are hundreds of Christians in Rome, and the church is still strong after he's done. Just to know a little bit about Nero, although we don't know how much of this actually was gossip, but some of it seems to come from pretty reliable sources. He forced Poppaea Sabina to leave her husband, Otho. He got her pregnant, and while she was pregnant, he kicked her to death. It does seem to have affected him psychologically, because he regretted it afterwards, but he didn't know how to control his temper. He reportedly tied up nobles and assaulted them sexually. He reportedly went marauding at night. He murdered his mother, as we mentioned before. He murdered his mentors, Seneca and Burrus. Well, Seneca had been part of an assassination plot. Burrus disappeared. Nobody knew where he went. Even though he died in the year 68, many believed that he was still alive. And Jews and Christians expected him to come back. And we find this in a number of sources from the early period. It speaks of his head being wounded, the head of the beast being wounded and then coming back. And that's treated more explicitly in chapter 17, as we noted before. Now, is it a new Nero or one like Nero? Romans spoke of Claudius as another Germanicus. Again, he was a Roman war hero. Tiberius as another Augustus. In the New Testament, John the Baptist is another Elijah. So it's not saying that literally Nero was coming back, but it would be one like Nero. And so we have the contrast between the dragon, the beast, and the lamb. And okay, let me find one thing that, So you have the unity of the beast's kingdom, like the Roman Empire. But you also have the unity of all peoples and nations and tribes under the Lamb. You have both kinds of unity in Revelation, just like you have both kinds of unity in the book of Daniel. In the book of Daniel, people from every tribe and nation and tongue are to bow before the image that Nebuchadnezzar has set up. but also people from every nation and language and tongue bow before the Son of Man in Daniel chapter 7. Same way in Revelation. So the world has its own unity of its own values. The church must have a unity of its values. We're taken from every people and nation and tribe. We have all of our diversity still with us, every nation and tribe and language, but we are united by something greater because Jesus is our Lord, and therefore what unites us is greater than what is different among us. So who would close us in prayer?